Hi everyone, it's Steph here, doing another video for Neuro Pride Ireland 2021. I'm going to have a look at something called the double empathy problem, or it's sometimes described as double empathy theory. What on earth is that? Okay, this is an idea that was put together over a little bit of time and then published by Dr. Damian Milton, an autistic academic and a lovely guy with excellent taste in music. And essentially, it says something really, really straightforward and obvious, despite the fact that the title sounds a little bit complicated. It just basically says that empathy is something that works both ways. And actually, empathy really is kind of dependent on communication. Communication kind of works both ways. You need a listener and somebody communicating. And that it's something that affects autistic people and non-autistic people alike. So it works both ways. And it's particularly something that was formulated to do with autistics. But I mean, this applies to all people. But what makes a big difference, particularly as regards autistic people and all minority people or people in any given kind of context, is that non-autistic people have the advantage of numbers. So if you pick a number, say, okay, 5% of people are autistic, that means that 95% of people out of any population are non-autistic. So if you're not an autistic person, you're far more likely to act or say something and for people to be empathetic. In other words, understand your intention and your emotions and where you're coming from. 19 times out of 20. And that kind of suggests to you that maybe you're communicating that really effectively. And, those are normal. And that one person out of 20, or quite possibly one person out of 50 or one person out of 100, is not getting it, and it's probably their fault because everyone else gets it. And that's why the double empathy theory and the idea of the double empathy problem is so important to understanding how empathy and mutual understanding and communication works, particularly between people who are in a minority situation and the majority population, and specifically in this case as regards autistic people in a largely non-autistic world. Empathy. Autistic people were theorized to lack empathy. This is something that goes back like 30, 35 years. Unfortunately, it's a complete red herring of an idea. And it's built on this idea that, like, well, most people have good empathy towards the intentions and feelings of others. So if somebody doesn't, it must be because they lack empathy. Okay, it's a lack of a theory of mind, as they call it, where you can actually model the way another person's mind is seeing the world. Unfortunately, the idea that autistic people lack empathy is used to explain those communication barriers. The idea, it's the autistic people who are defective or disordered, and that's why there's a communication barrier. And that idea that autistic people are disordered is an easy way to justify forcing unnecessary therapy to try and reshape autistic people and fix them. But the truth actually is, not only makes more sense, but actually it's an awful lot simpler. And I kind of hinted at it already. If you take any two people in the world with a different worldview, Finnish 12-year-old and a Japanese 56-year-old. They're going to have a different worldview because they have grown up with that different worldview, because culturally and through their own experiences, their model of the world is different. So they're going to have a different worldview. There's cultural factors involved, but also, their own lived experience. And because of that, they will struggle to empathize with each other because the things that make sense to them will be slightly different. This is not earth-shattering news, really. What a surprise. People who have got different experiences will have a different way of looking at things. Not exactly rocket science, really, to work that out. It's just when you apply that to the situation of autistics and non-autistics, something very obvious gives a huge insight. So really, having different ideas and different priorities matters to understanding all of this. But there's other things that come into play, and I've kind of hinted at them already. For autistic people in particular, other things come into play. This idea that most people aren't autistic, and because of that, rarely need to relate to autistic people. They rarely come in contact with autistic people, certainly with autistic people who aren't masking and trying to kind of pass as non-autistic. So it's easy to imagine that the communication barriers that do exist between autistic people and non-autistic people are the autistic people's fault, because they only rarely happen, and they happen, it seems, when autistic people are around. So you kind of say, well, there's the only new factor in the situation. Here's the problem. They occur at the same time. Presumably, this new factor, the autistic person in the story, is the reason why. And this isn't helped by kind of pervasive bias in how non-autistic people are taught to look at autistic people. Autistic people are kind of seen as disordered. I mean, that kind of official diagnosis title that's associated with autistic people, sort of autism spectrum disorder, it's right there in the word, the evil D, that's what it's called. If you inherently see people as disordered, when you see something which doesn't seem to function as you expect, it's not unreasonable to expect that this disorder and the people associated with that disorder are the reason why. So the experience of an impairment to communication kind of makes sense being associated with autistic people, because the pervasive message that everybody knows is that those autistic people are kind of antisocial, right? So they must be the reason why. Actually, that's wrong. It's so wrong, and I'm going to explain why. And this is part of what came out of Damian Milton's work. Milton suggested that both sides communicate just fine, but in different ways. And actually, research has shown this to be the case. And it's something that comes, and what kind of prompted this, I think, was the fact that, personal observations have shown this to be the case, that like when you put a bunch of autistic people together in a room, they communicate excellently well. Pretty much as a bunch of non-autistic people in a room tend to communicate excellently well. The problem is when you kind of mix the two. And research has kind of backed this up. More than that, as a side effect of this research, it's actually shown not only that non-autistics communicate better with each other and that autistics communicate better with each other, but overall, autistic people tend to be more efficient and more accurate in their communication than non-autistics. And this is a product of the way autistic people and non-autistic people typically communicate. And I've used that heading precision engineering for a good reason. This is something we should be proud of as autistic people. it's very likely that by avoiding innuendo and hints and kind of subtext and stuff, helps autistic people to communicate better. And one of those ideas that autistic people are very blunt and too honest. Can you imagine the idea of being too honest? By simply saying the thing, you communicate better. All right, by dropping hints and stuff, you expect people to have to read into it, and hints can get missed. And unfortunately, non-autistic people tend to assume that there has to be a subtext somewhere, but some of these words aren't what they really mean. You have to read into it. Unfortunately, if there's no subtext, a perfectly clear message can get misunderstood. So it looks like most of the communication failures are actually due to non-autistic people simply not reading a perfectly clear message and trying to read a subtext that doesn't exist. It's as simple as that. That's the double empathy problem. And if you want to read a little bit more on that, there's a link there to the original paper by Damian Milton in 2012 and a blog post by Dr. Melanie Hayworth, a recent one, which talks through it step by step and just gives a pretty much the same explanation I've put forward here, but in text. So you can read back over a few times and mull over its implications and so on. Okay, thank you for listening.